Welcome back, everybody, to UVTA Premium, and we are going to talk about die roll number 6. Right? Die roll number 6 has been a pretty stalwart thing. In fact, all the die rolls have been pretty much settled for a very, very long time now. It's been very solid, and playtesting has gone pretty well in that regard. However, lately it's come to my attention that sometimes players are very vulnerable at the beginning of the game. Okay, early vulnerabilities can leave you with some frustrating game experiences. And what we're trying to figure out here is, though, die roll 6, as it stands. Let's just go back to the definitions. It allows you 2 actions, right? And then, of course, unlimited activities, but it also gives you the ability to sabotage, right? You pick an opponent and you can sabotage them, right? Well, recently it was brought to light to me that, hey, maybe that's just not fair. And the reason it feels like it's not fair is because early in the game, when you're incredibly vulnerable, it can be very challenging to get the ball rolling, and overcome the inertia. And so in order to keep that, to initiate that spark, you just can't have too many adverse circumstances, right? And so what we did was, the more I really thought about it, I created a pretty nice list of pros and cons for either keeping it or for changing it. And so we're just going to go over this real quick, and then, the ultimate goal of this particular video is to just kind of give you a little bit of a flavor of, well, how do you come to a conclusion about this, right? Because the ultimate goal is really just to create what's the most fun, right? So what are the pros? What are the pros of keeping die roll 6 as is? Right? Well, the first one is the reason for keeping it is it's the exact opposite of this, right? Die roll 1. Die roll 1 is the most limiting option in the game. You only do one thing. You draw an adversity card and you have to do what it says, right? And so what do we have on the opposite of that? Well, we'd have die roll 6, which is the most empowering, right? You have the most options on that particular die roll outcome, or that particular die roll. And so that sense of complete opposites is a very good thing. We like that. We're trying to create something harmonious, beautiful, and balanced. That's a very nice feature to have. Okay, so moving on to the next pro. The die roll 6 is very powerful, but there's still only a 1 in 6 chance of getting it. And not only that, everyone gets an equal opportunity. Your neighbor could roll a die roll 6 just as much as you can. So, the statistics and the probabilities say everything should just kind of work out. Or seemingly so. Humans are very limited in that capacity. We can be very, very wrong about stats and probability. Anyway, so there's that. There's another pro, and that is you can only sabotage one person at a time. All right. The whole point of sabotage was to allow players to maybe undo some of the positive things that they were doing, and level the playing field a little bit, but randomly, right? And not only that, the fact that you can't sabotage everyone else at the same time is vitally important to this concept, right? Because if you could do that, then it's kind of a no-brainer. You would be screaming unfair, unfair, unfair pretty quickly. So anyway, that's the one. Those are the 3 pros. Now, what are the cons? Well, there's vulnerabilities early in the game, and that may be too much. That's kind of the main point, right? That's the main problem. If you're too vulnerable and too many people are rolling 6s right in a row, that could really hamper you. If the, every time you put out an item in order to be productive, and someone's always undercutting you, pulling the rug out from under you, that can be a bit demoralizing, right? That's no good. So that's one of the cons. The other one is, yeah, like I said, multiple parties can gang up on you if they just happen to roll sixes. That kind of defeats the idea of, oh, I can only sabotage one person at a time. Well, the more players you add into the game, obviously the greater chances of them being able to sabotage you increases. That's kind of how that goes. Now the other con is, the other con is simply the fact that whenever a die roll 6 comes up, the most savvy players, the most competitive, or whatever you want to call it, whoever has the greatest will to win, is always going to use that sabotage opportunity. They're not going to overlook it, and they're going to use it every time. And so that just kind of reinforces the fact that, yes, in fact, this is a very powerful roll if you choose to use it wisely, right? So those are the cons. So what is my remedy then? What if I don't like it? What if the cons outweigh the pros? Which, by the way, they don't. It's actually three versus 3. Okay, so it's even. But if I did want to make the change, how would I do it, and why? Well, what would I do? Well, that's something else I thought about. And what I did was, I thought, well, why not just make sabotage an action? If I make sabotage an action, then the player still has that option, but what they have to do is they have to figure out if it's one of the actions, they're obviously not going to be able to do 2 productive farm actions, right? And so that's where things get really cool. And so what are the pros and cons of maybe making that change, right? Well, the first pro is it addresses the problem. Early vulnerabilities in the game would go away, we think, because the person has to think twice about sabotage, when in fact maybe they really need to think about being more productive on their turn, right? The other pro is it reduces the power of the roll, right? Because we already know that. We're taking basically an action away, and we're making them choose, right? Another pro to this, the one pro is that it's consistent with the rest of the game, right? Oofed is about difficult, hard choices and interesting ones to make, creating a better product. And well, what happens is if you force people to make difficult choices, you've created a much more interesting and pleasurable game experience. And so if I do this, it's consistent with some of the other logic that's going on in the game, where you have multiple options per turn and multiple paths and decision trees to go down, right? So in that sense, it's very, very rewarding to do that, right? Okay, so those are some of the major pros. What are the cons of doing this, right? Well, one of them is negotiation is already available. The fact that you can negotiate on a die roll 6 instead of sabotage, that has always been a sort of a stopgap or a pressure relief valve to diminish some of the power of the sabotage, right? That's an adverse consequence for everyone when somebody does a sabotage. And so to mitigate that, I went ahead and I put in the ability to negotiate, right? So anyway, one problem is there's fewer interactions with players. A truly great balanced game has more interactions. Instead of spinning your wheels thinking silently and then it's somebody else's turn, you definitely want lively and interesting discussion and debate, or at least some sort of interactions, so that you can enjoy the social experience being in someone's presence or company, right? So that's a good thing. All right, so if you reduce the ability to sabotage in this fashion, you make it less likely to happen because, well, players are going to choose to be productive on their roles instead of sabotaging. Then that just limits the ability to foster more interesting interactions between players, right? So that's important. So that's a very big con. Likewise, this could also slow the game down, believe it or not. Even though there's fewer interactions, what could potentially happen is the person could sit there spinning their wheels thinking really deeply about, man, can I sabotage now or should I not? And pace is kind of a big deal. A brisker pace is always welcome, right? And so maybe we don't want to get bogged down with the minutiae of things, right? And this is the sort of thing that I think would slow down gameplay. I mean, we want to try to keep it somewhat brisk. So there's always that to consider. All right, so those are the pros and cons of both cases. Keeping things as is, what are the positives and negatives, and then what are the positive and negatives of making that change. How does it benefit players, or how does it detract from gameplay, right? The overall game experience. So that's quite an interesting list. And if you really want to know, right now it's 3 pros and 3 cons to keep it as is, and then it's 4 pros and I believe 3 cons to make the change. But really, when it kind of boils down to is it really true if I make the change, are players truly less vulnerable at the beginning of the game, right? Because there's really no way to know exactly how they're going to react. Just because I roll a die roll 6, what am I actually going to do in that early game, right? Because, I really want to get the ball up and rolling on what I'm doing. And, if I always choose to sabotage, I'm also limiting myself to just one action where I can do something positive, right? And so I'm not even sure it's true that if you do make this change, that's what people would really do. How would the gameplay alter? And then, of course, that just comes down to more and more playtesting and experience. So that's kind of where things stand right now. I kind of, I'm leaning just barely on keeping things the way they are. But those are tremendously important points that I just brought up. And the one that's really stands out to me is the one that says, hey, this is consistent with the rest of the game if we just make this a harder choice. And also, the late game scenarios may change too, right? That creates a very, very difficult scenario for people later in the game. And so, a lot of pros and cons to keep it, and a lot of pros and cons not to. So, anyway, so I hope this gives you a flavor of what playtesting looks like sometimes, right? Because, you can really get into some deep intellectual waters in a hurry, right? When you're trying to think about, what good game balance is, how much math is involved, statistics and probability, game theory, economics, psychology of players. So it's a huge canard, and it's not an easy one to solve. At least I can't. Not easily, not without a lot of thorough playtesting. So that's where I'm going to leave it right now. And I hope you learned a lot from this because, this was an extensive, very deep subject, right? All right, so thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.